Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl Ames.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Peter Van Buren, author of We Meant Well, and recently banned from Twitter, and you're listening to The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show, with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
He said it. Last week, Peter Van Buren was censored by Twitter. I said the C word, censored. We say proudly that he's a friend of the show, and he and Pete worked in the same forward operating base during his 24 years serving our democracy in the State Department. From your last appearance on the show, Peter, Pete actually called you a pariah of the State Department. Now, last week, you were booted off of Twitter.
I just can't seem to keep a lot of friends these days. You know, I've been censored twice in the United States, once by the American government when I wrote my whistleblower book, We Meant Well about the war in Iraq, and the State Department and the U.S. government went after me. And then now by Twitter. And if you're keeping track at home, I've been censored twice on Twitter. Once, of course, when I was visiting Iran in May, and the Iranian government bans Twitter and decides in Iran who gets to see what on that platform. In their case, they say no Peter Van Buren. And then last week, Twitter banned me from their platform here in the United States. And so I've been banned by two governments and one very large corporation for essentially saying the very same thing, that the U.S. government lied to its people and its media in Iraq. It's lying to its people here, that the media is failing in its role as a protector of the people's interests. And apparently, one day I'm going to get the message that that is not a popular message to keep putting out there, and maybe I'll stop getting banned from places.
I want to say that beyond being banned from Twitter or censored, my censor was my word, but I think you would use the same.
Yes.
I want to say specifically Twitter's words, which were that they have banned you because you used language that, quote, harasses, intimidates, or uses fear to silence someone else's voice.
I think we need a little bit of background here to kind of lead into this. On Sunday of last week, I was picking up on a thread that was started by Glenn Greenwald on Twitter. Earlier that day, President Trump had made some remarks about the press being the enemy of the people, and Glenn Greenwald had picked up on that and was talking about how the media had assisted and aided various governments from the Spanish-American War right up until yesterday in waging America's wars overseas, and that the media had been at least partially responsible for some of those wars and in getting Americans to engage and support those wars. And I picked up that thread by saying that during the time I was in Iraq, Pete Turner and I were both in Iraq in the same place at the same time, though he worked for the Department of Defense, I worked for the Department of State, and we were not he wasn't my boss and I wasn't his. We just were coworkers. But my job with the Department of State involved me lying to the media. Some of them were sort of broad lies, like we're winning the war, and some of them were small lies, like a particular development or reconstruction project that we were working on, some dumb school or road was succeeding where it wasn't. And I commented on Twitter that the media were remarkably easy to fool in Iraq, that my colleagues and I held them in kind of open contempt because they rarely knew enough to ask good questions. They hardly ever asked many real questions at all. And oftentimes were much more interested in getting some story as opposed to trying to find out what the story was. And it was really as simple as that. And at that point, the dogs came out, the hounds were let loose, and a whole series of journalists and wannabe journalists and their various hangers-on began attacking me on Twitter, and I was essentially turned from a whistleblower, and Pete's listeners may know that in my book, when I talked about what happened and what went wrong in Iraq, I lost my job. I was almost prosecuted by the federal government. I was under enormous pressure in return for the public service that I thought I was providing. That whistleblowing was turned into the fact that I was lying about lies. And people online launched into me claiming, well, why would anyone want to believe you now? Because you just admitted you're a liar. And all these journalists just said, well, you lied to us, and it's not really our responsibility to pick those lies apart. It's on you, buddy. And things got a little more confusing at that point. Eventually, a lot of second-level people got involved and began throwing the usual kind of Twitter garbage at me. Someone said I'm a garbage human being, and it peaked or didn't peak with a bad zombie joke on my part. Actually, it was Sunday, so Fear the Walking Dead was actually on, and I said something flippant. Nothing I'm particularly proud of, like, maybe someday a guy with a Make America Great Again hat is going to eat your face, to one of the journalists. And he reported me to Twitter. And Twitter took swift and certain action based on the 29,000 tweets that I have sent out over a period of 7 years. Apparently, that kind of bad joke was the equivalent of inciting violence and causing people to be silenced through fear. And I was permanently banned from Twitter. I heard nothing from them for 2 days until I got the automated response with the words that you said there. And they have not answered any of my communications, any of my attempts to appeal or ask for more information. They simply went to radio silence, and so did I.
So that's a whole bunch of
Yeah.
stuff.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. And this is one of the reasons why you're here, because you and I did work in the same area, and I think we both agree. Well, the reporters that would come would be there, and I'm using your words. They were there for a story, not the story. And I had, the area, like, I was in that area for years. I knew all kinds of things, and not once did I hear a reporter ask a relevant question to anybody who knew anything or understood all of the problems. And like you said, there's so many problems with, like, water. And when they closed a place called Fob Hammer, where you and I lived, way out in the middle of the desert, we had so much water generating capacity. And I had a couple of the parliament representatives come in, and we talked to the commander there, and he's like, I don't know, I can't go out there and grab that stuff. I guess you guys should just try to go take it or something. I mean, this is how backwards this whole thing was. And so you're right. Like, you guys, you were certainly not allowed to be honest and say the Green Medine was a bunch of bullshit. You certainly couldn't say that and be honest that we're giving them stacks and stacks. Like, I remember having hundreds of thousands of dollars that we were going to hand over to those guys. So they brought all the pretty girls from Baghdad in town. They wore really pretty dresses, and they had a Canadian Iraqi guy with a silk suit that stood around. And boy, they they just put on it. Heck, you may have been in the room when we did that. You certainly went to the Green Medine, so you couldn't be honest about it.
No.
And now, when you're honest on Twitter, you also get censored here. What the fuck is going on?
Well, I wish I knew a better answer to that question than the one that I have, which is the election of Donald Trump has caused America to lose its mind in a way that reminds me, the circumstances are obviously very different, but reminds me in the way that America lost its mind after the events of September 11th. If listeners were politically with us at that point in time, they remember that in those days after 9/11, no theory was too crazy, no idea was discarded as too off the radar, no line of thinking was too out there for consideration. And in a way, I feel the same thing happened with the election of Donald Trump. Liberals became conservatives, conservatives became liberals, everyone's labels got all mixed up. You found yourself switching teams on a near daily basis. The media has been leading this charge. If you still need a little bit of evidence, take a look at this week's treatment of Omarosa, Donald Trump's once upon a time apprentice. When she was in the White House, no one would have believed her if she said the stove was hot. Today, because she's outside of the White House, every word she says is beamed through the media as if it's come down on stone tablets. And we've seen the same thing happen with Michael Cohen. We've seen the same thing happen with a whole cast of characters. And on a macro level in our society as well, the issue with Twitter really opens up the question of what has happened to free speech in the United States. Way back in time, by which I mean about 18 months ago, before the election results, most Americans held to a concept that was very dear to the Republic and very dear to democracy in general, and that is you support the right to free speech not necessarily everyone's contents. And so we can, each of us, support the other's right to speak freely, to have access to things like Twitter or the public square, whether that's the physical location or the cyber version of the public square, and violently oppose one another's thoughts while equally strongly supporting one another's rights to speak out. That was the basis of our democracy. That was the system that the founding fathers set up. And the idea was that the marketplace of ideas, what you said, what I said, what others said, was going to be made available to the people. The informed citizenry that Jefferson spoke about would sort through these ideas. They'd be smart enough to do that. They would feel empowered to do that, and they would discard the bad ideas and hang on to the good ones. Now, I am not the person standing here saying it always worked out right. Certainly, American history is littered with all sorts of bad turns and missteps and terrible, terrible events that impacted people horribly. But I'm not sure that you can blame any of that on too much free speech. But that, in fact, is what's happening now in the United States. Following the overblown reports of Russian influence, a lot of people who oppose the election of Donald Trump have come to the conclusion that too much free speech has become a bad thing. And universities need to, they've invented some new speak terms to help make this all go down a little bit easier. They want to deplatform people whose views they don't agree with by not giving them public places to speak, allowing universities to get rid of them. They want to take advantage of the fact that the First Amendment, rather than decry the fact that the First Amendment doesn't cover everything in the United States broadly, they want to gleefully celebrate the fact that private organizations are allowed to ignore the concepts of free speech, whether they're in the First Amendment or broader within our society. They want to celebrate the idea that @Jack on Twitter can unilaterally wave his finger and point at you and say, that's hate speech. That's inciting fear, and you shall be silenced. If anybody harkens back to the days of McCarthy in the 1950s, when all you had to do was point a finger at Scott or Pete and say, you're a communist, and your life would be over at that point. You couldn't get a job. You couldn't get a place to speak in public. I think hate speech has become that moniker in our current society. And I fear for a country, I fear for myself in a society where too much free speech is considered a dangerous thing rather than the opposite.
Me too. So if we go back to the incident itself that got you banned from Twitter,
or we believe got me banned, Twitter has never and will not apparently tell me which of the 29,000 tweets I sent out over the course of 7 years was the one that was actually responsible. We're guessing it's the one about the Make America Great zombie, because that is the one that we know was reported, because the little Twitter, the little tweet guy, the little twit who said it was offending, actually announced that. But, you know, the key thing about this, the big brotherish thing about this, is that we don't really know what it was that caused me to be banned. This is not a transparent process. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted to make that clear.
No, that's a good clarification. Was it Glenn Greenwald?
You know, I don't think Glenn turned me in, because Glenn and I have this weird intersection of agreement on issues like unfettered free speech, like our thoughts on many of the issues surrounding Russiagate and things like that. And whether it's ironic or not, Glenn was a very enthusiastic supporter of me back in 2011 when the government had come after me on free speech grounds, saying that I couldn't publish my book, and then I couldn't hold my job as punishment for publishing my book. So I don't think it was Glenn. You never know, though. One of the great things about corporate censorship is it allows people to whisper behind your back. Maybe it was my kids who turned me in. That was a popular tactic in Germany before World War II, and I think the Russians, the Soviets, liked that as well. They got your kids to rat on you. So maybe it was one of my children who did it.
Okay.
Point is, I don't know why I was really banned. The automated response that they sent me that you read out earlier was kind of short on detail, will be generous. And instead, I'm left here simply because they're afraid of me, I guess. They're afraid of the noise and want the silence.
I'm going to stand on my BA in mass communication with an emphasis on TV and radio and say I thought that the standard was you can say pretty much anything you want, but you can't go fire in a theater. Like that's the measure, right? And
Sure.
Granted, Twitter is a private entity and everything else, but hate speech doesn't satisfy that. So, assuming that and look, sometimes you're a dick on Twitter. Just you say things and I'm like, whoa, Peter, man. But I can take it. I can tolerate, even if I'm like, we agree, but you're just a little rougher than I would be. That is all part of the marketplace of ideas. And other times you say things that need to be said that I'm like, I'm glad you said that, because there's a lot of dickery that goes on out there, and if you disagree with someone, it's like all of a sudden you are part and parcel of a completely different thing. Now all of a sudden, I've been assigned, a position of being anti-abortion or pro-abortion. I'm either pro-Trump or against Trump, and you get the whole, like, I'm assigned a whole platform just because I said I think that things in North Korea are better than they were 8 months ago.
May I address my dickness, please?
Please.
Yes, because I want to confirm that, actually. In fact, I want to say that not only am I a dick, I'm a terrible person. I'm rude to babies, mean to puppies. I am just I have bad body odor. I am a miserable person in every possible sense of that word, in every definition of it. And so what? Because this is not a popularity contest. Free speech is not about who looks good in a swimsuit. And I also don't look good in a swimsuit, for the record.
Damn.
This is not about that. If you think I'm a dick, you can block me. You can unfollow me. You can unfriend me. You can mute me. You can do all of those things, and you and I will never communicate again. And that's wide open. That's very much a part of free speech and the free speech debate. What we're talking about is Twitter making that decision for you.
Yeah.
Not allowing you the opportunity to decide who's worth listening to under what circumstances. But like when I was in Iran, a large organization anonymously saying, we're deciding for everyone, you can't listen to this guy. And that's where the problem is.
And for the record, I don't think you're a dick.
No. I'm willing to stipulate that. We can move forward from that point.
Well, that's another thing, is the willingness to stipulate that, even if it's just for the sake of argument. Because what we're talking about here is the silencing of the free exchange of ideas.
Yep.
And, if our listeners don't know this, I lean to the left, pretty far to the left. I'm artistic. I've always grown up in a musical household. I'm not a snowflake. I punch motherfucker in the mouth, but I like Glenn Greenwald. And the reason I asked specifically if it was him, because I was prepared to be disappointed if it was him, because I think he's made of better stuff than that.
Yeah.
The point is that when I listen to your ideas, when I hear or read the things that you have to say, they make me think. Now, do I agree with them all? No. Do I agree with a lot of them? Yeah. Why is that? Because we are relatively intelligent people. I'm lumping myself in with you. Maybe I don't deserve to, but I will. And I think that when I hear ideas that oppose my own, I have to be able to call my faith in those ideas to question. Because if I really am to believe in them, I have to test them.
Well, let's take that a step further. What happens if Twitter and other platforms are successful in what they appear to be doing, which is taking dissenting voices and silencing them? And what if a person is equally as aggressive about using block and unfollow and mute and those features to silence other voices? What are you left with in your media world?
You're left with the ideas that come from people who are someone else's choices.
And you're left probably with a lot of ideas you already agree with that won't challenge you, that won't cause you to think through your own positions. You're basically at that point self-propagandizing.
Yeah.
And that is a very dangerous thing in a democracy. When people use the tools to silence other voices, and then organizations like Twitter and Facebook and all the other platforms band together to keep voices out of the marketplace, we're talking about a process of propaganda there. You're talking about limiting what gets said publicly to the point where people start to only hear one thing. I have absolutely nothing good to say about Alex Jones. Others may like what he has to say, though I have to admit, 4 years ago, I was on his program talking about Iraq and Iraq only. He gave me a chance to speak. He didn't interrupt me. He didn't ask a lot of questions, but he let me talk, and I can't say I was mistreated there, so there's full disclosure. But the point is that in the last week, we have seen a concerted, combined effort by every social media platform, ironically except Twitter for some reason, to disappear him, to make his videos go away from YouTube, from Vimeo, from Facebook, from all sorts of places, to the point where today it becomes very difficult to find his stuff. Now, Alex Jones is sort of in the celebrity category. You know he exists, and if you were listening to him 2 weeks ago and want to keep listening, you can find him on the web and that. But the point is, you may not be able to find people whose voices have yet to reach celebrity status. People who do blogs or podcasts or important voices that, for better or worse, haven't reached star status. And if those platforms shut those voices down, they disappear. Because free speech.
The other thing about it is, I don't like Alex Jones. I can't stand that insufferable blowhard. But he can reveal himself to be a douche.
Exactly.
And if anybody smart is listening to him, they're going to sort out their opinions about what he has to say for themselves.
I'll tell you about a naughty little hobby I have, and that is when I'm bored or tired or just need to relax, I watch conspiracy videos on YouTube and try to, as quickly as possible in my own mind, debunk them. So there's the World Trade Center conspiracy, and there's the Kennedy assassination conspiracy, and there's the lizard people conspiracy, whatever. I kind of pick and choose among them. But the point is, as kind of a hobby, I watch them, and I see how quickly I can figure out what the point they're making and how quickly I can factually debunk that in my own mind. It's kind of a bit of entertainment. And the same thing goes for most of what Alex Jones has to say. It doesn't take long to figure out that he's there mostly to promote Alex Jones. That's not the point. The point is very much we can argue about what he says as content. The bad news is when organizations take advantage of the fact that they're not bound by law, regulation, or apparently societal public pressure to offer their platforms more broadly, that those voices get silenced. We lose that opportunity to debunk people. We lose that opportunity to push bad ideas out of the marketplace. Instead, what we do is we allow them to fester in an underworld, a separate part of the web, to the point where at some near future, you're going to have people so walled off from other ideas that they become very, very dangerous because they forget what thinking is all about.
But Peter, what you just described, the situation in reverse, because you have, it appears to me, you have people coming out of the academy today who are not equipped to deal with an opinion that is not their own, and not only that, they don't want to hear it, and they want to punish you if you dare share something with them that they may find offensive. And so you already have the wall, I would suggest, already exists in the American mind, and Alan Bloom predicted this back in the late 80s.
Well, if you want to take that one step further, there's a large number of young people, apparently, in the United States who believe that it's perfectly okay to silence people by physical violence, by punching them, if you label them a Nazi.
Right.
I had nothing good to say about Nazis. I don't like Nazis. But that word no longer seems to have a meaning that is universally understood. And instead, what's happened is we've reached a point where simply labeling someone a Nazi, for whatever reason, then dehumanizes them. They're no longer a person with free speech. They're no longer a person with ideas. They're a Nazi. And once they're a Nazi, you're allowed to do anything you want to them, including physically beat them down if that's what you choose to do to silence them. It's kind of like my wife doesn't like to step on bugs except cockroaches. Now she'll step on a cockroach. A spider, she's got to sweep up in the dustpan and carry 3 miles away and release in a wooded area. Well, the idea is that once you label a person that same way, you're a cockroach, you're a Nazi, you're a racist, you're a sexist. Once you label them, they're no longer a human being, and they no longer have ideas. In fact, you have given yourself permission not to listen to them. The same way that my lovely wife gives herself permission to squash a bug, even though she otherwise isn't real fond of that idea. And that's what's going on here. Twitter is just simply what Twitter did to me, and it did to others, and what platforms are doing to Alex Jones. And keep in mind, we're talking, Pete, because you and I had run into each other way back in the desert in Iraq. But there's a lot of people on Twitter who get banned or purged or censored who don't have access to even your platform. Right. And those people just simply disappear. It's the memory hole that George Orwell warned us of. They no longer exist, because in the 21st century, free speech is about more than simply having access to the town square, if you will. It's about being discoverable in an increasingly complex environment. Once upon a time, Thomas Jefferson's day, you could go out to the town square, stand up on a ladder, and tell the world your thoughts. And people who were interested in listening to others would go to the town square, and there you were. Well, on the internet, it doesn't work that way. You can set up a blog and say the most incredibly insightful things ever recorded by humans, and you don't really exist until someone finds you there. And that's what makes platforms like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube different than other sort of private companies, if you will. They are part of that discovery process. And if they eliminate the discovery angle, they are essentially eliminating free speech. It's like trying to compare Amazon to the little store down the street that sells stationery and small items and say, well, they're both just places that sell stuff. You have to consider the scale, you have to consider the global monopoly, and you have to consider the environment, in this case, the issue of discoverability that these platforms actually represent. And by allowing Twitter and Google and all these others to become global monopolies, we have, without much discussion, handed to them the power to determine what can be said, what can be listened to, what you can hear. And they do that on their own with no transparency. People like to talk about, oh, you violated Twitter's rules. And, saying a zombie is going to eat his face is violating a Twitter rule and things like that. Well, who makes those rules? How are those rules interpreted? None of that. You're giving it a facade.
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
Interpreted. None of that. You're giving it a facade of legality when in fact it isn't that way at all.
It's completely arbitrary. And let's
it's
understand,
completely arbitrary. Yes.
Twitter's headquarters are on Market Street in San Francisco, a place where within the last 5 years, a male could stand buck naked right out in front of the door there, and no one would have a problem with it. So when they want to be arbiters, you have to wonder where they're drawing their arbiters from, because Sarah Jeong certainly has written stuff that is much more hate-filled, legitimately racist, and I have no problem with her having a Twitter account. And if you look at all the tweets following up her, there's a lot of conversation about who she is and what she is, and people that support her and people that denounce her in the New York Times. Why aren't we afforded that opportunity for your tweets? Like, what if you're going to censor one, then you're promoting the others. And so I gather that Jack is for racism. Is that what we're left? And against zombies, though. Does not like zombies.
He's not a big zombie guy. Dude, I had a heavy lunch. Maybe one of you guys would want to explain who Sarah Jeong is for the people. I don't want to bring that all up.
She works for the New York Times now, and she wrote some very evil and hateful and racist things about white people, primarily white males. And if you go, and I didn't really want to bring it up because the important thing isn't what she wrote. It's just that no one can read that and say,
Well, let me say this, Pete,
Yeah.
because you are a white male, and somebody can say, well, you're a white male. Of course, you don't get to say that because you're a white male. And to
Yep.
some degree, they'd be right. But I'm not a white male. I am a male. But I agree with what Pete just said. And there were some things that were said that didn't need to be said. I mean, I am, like I said, left-leaning brown person.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm after here is the ability to exchange ideas with thoughtful people. So now what has happened, really, if we can sum this all up, is that, okay, I get that there is hate speech out there, and I get that there is some desire to regulate nonsensical speech that simply incites violence. But on Zombie Day, on a day where everybody knows there's a zombie television show that's sweeping the nation and is very wildly popular, making a joke, unfunny as somebody may think it is, about zombies eating someone's face, is almost a way to bring levity to a discussion that now is suddenly deemed hate speech. You know, what you were doing was bringing levity, but I want to bring this up because I think before we get in our own echo chamber,
Sure.
I want to say that because they are a company that can reserve the right to refuse service to anybody they choose, just like if you are a liquor store owner and somebody comes in and you don't want to serve them, where is it that the line is drawn? Where do you think is the fair place to say, okay, now you're too big?
Yep.
Now you're a platform that the world is depending on to be a repository of all of these writings of people who are exchanging ideas.
Well, you know,
at what point is the line?
The idea of bringing government or law into this is not the first place I would want to go. In saying, well, now we want to have the government telling Twitter what it can and can't ban. I don't see that as necessarily the right place. I guess in a more perfect world, and again, we were sort of edging on that world 18 months ago, the people who use platforms like Twitter were not willing to accept that censorship was part of the use of that platform. They were willing, it seemed, to more broadly accept a range of ideas and to use the tools Twitter makes very easily available to them to make those decisions individually. And in a better world, we would have more people in America who understood that the right to speech does not mean you have to support the words that someone is saying. And that if you don't agree with what I said, you argue with me. If you don't want to argue with me, you're welcome to block me or mute me as the case may be. And that people were not willing to hand that power over to an anonymous authority like Twitter. I think the answer is very simple, and that is for folks to kind of take a deep breath and understand that it was not too much free speech that resulted in election results they didn't like. There were a number of factors. We're not going to get into how Trump got elected or anything like that, but I think I would hope that most people would agree that it wasn't too much free speech that caused the election to turn out the way that it did. We find ourselves in America too ready to seize on the meaning that best fits our political needs at the time. You know, sometimes if you tell somebody, go jump in a lake, you're trying to end an argument in a snarky way, and other times it's an invitation to go swimming. Intelligent people, thoughtful people know the difference. And I think in my case with the zombie joke, and I think if I tell you to go jump in a lake, are we allowed to say kiss your own ass? I don't think, or go yourself. I mean, I don't think most people literally believe we mean for you to contort your body in a way that you can smooch your backside or that you perform a unilateral physical act on yourself. I think people understand those as rhetoric. What happens on Twitter now in 2018 is that people are primed to find the explanation that fits their political needs. And so what might have been an inappropriate joke is now sexism. What might have been an innocent remark can be found a way to be seen as racism. I'll give you another example from my Twitter wars last Sunday. I mentioned that the reporters that I met in Iraq often were far more concerned about their appearance and their makeup than they were about traveling long distances. They wanted to go nearby. And one of the reporters, a woman, jumped all over that as grotesquely sexist and revealing of my true personality. And I said, hey, the people who I ran into who were most concerned about their appearance were pretty boys from CNN, not women. And so, but you jumped to that. You jumped to that conclusion that I must have been making a sexist remark because it was the interpretation that allowed you to move forward in condemning me as a person rather than condemning my ideas. And that's where we go back to things like go jump in a lake and what have you. People need to understand and read beyond simply those words. This is what goes wrong when we fire people for old tweets or we dig up a blog post from someone when they were in high school 30 years earlier and use that as a way of getting them kicked out of their job or thrown out of what have you. We're going to see a lot of that in about a little bit less than a month when the Supreme Court nominee hearings come up. Rather than, and it's an extension, really, if you'll allow me, of what we're seeing with Twitter, where rather than look at Brett Kavanaugh's record as a justice and see if he's done good things as a judge or not, and is worthy of the honor of serving on the Supreme Court, you're going to find Democrats and Republicans cherry picking through decades worth of written opinions and pulling out sentences and trying to say, aha, look at this sentence. This says that he's a racist, a sexist, whatever term is going to be used against him. And I think that's what happened on Twitter to me. I think that's what happens all too often. There's a lot of people who aren't smart enough to know the difference, but I think the people making the decisions behind the scenes at Twitter and these other platforms are smart enough to know the difference. They're looking for the finest of hooks that they can use as an excuse, and once they have it, you disappear.
Is it because human beings have entered the information age and we're not quite experientially prepared for all of the information?
I think that maybe some of it may be a reaction to all of that, but I suspect more than that, it is people who are trying to put a gloss of fairness to all this. They're not, Twitter is not Facebook. When I say Twitter, I'm including all the social media platforms and those to come. You know, they're not quite ready to alienate as big a demographic as they would alienate if they said, look, we're just going to get rid of a bunch of people whose opinions we're afraid of, who we think might influence you, and we've got these big midterms coming up. It's really important, so we're going to get these guys off the grid and out of the way. They're not ready to do that yet, and so they've got to pretend that, oh my gosh, he said something that incited fear in others, or he's a racist, a sexist, or the one-size-fits-all hate speech. No one's ever been able to define that. The Supreme Court has struggled with definitions, but somehow a bunch of people in a back room at Twitter have figured out what hate speech is, darn it. And it seems to be remarkably similar to what people that used to be called liberals say, and people that used to be called libertarians, and people that used to be called anti-war advocates all say. That now seems to fall into hate speech. It also seems to fall under a very broad umbrella of, quote, white men, unquote. I'll just share that before I was a white man, I was a Jew, I was a Catholic, I was a Polak, I was a hunky, I was this or that or the other thing. We didn't become sort of a giant class of people till fairly recently, last I checked. One of my great fun projects is the history of New York City, where I live. And the history of New York City from about 1800 to about 1950 is white people fighting each other. Whether that's Protestants or Catholics or Germans or Italians or what have you. So a lot of this stuff is simple and it's simplistic. And these are all very dangerous trends in an environment where there are smart people looking to manipulate us and exploit us. The real smart folks haven't entered the arena yet. We're still looking at amateur efforts. The Russians buying Facebook ads and Twitter banning nobodies like me. That's all amateur stuff. But once the real pros step in and say, how do we want to shape this society? How do we want to manipulate voters? Once the full court press comes on, then it's time to be scared. But by then it's far too late to say, let's
we're in big
stop
trouble
that.
at that point.
You got to get it now when the canaries are dying in the coal mine. And by that, I mean me.
You are a pretty little bird, though. I mean, let's be honest.
I was a dick 10 minutes ago, and now I'm a pretty little bird. Make up your mind.
It's pretty wishy-washy that way.
I know. That's so me right there. I'm always wanting the middle. I'm on both sides of the argument. You bring up some really, really powerful points, especially like the New York stuff, and I'm always struck of that. Yes, this is our time, but let's understand that our time is not special. If you go back 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 100 years, the same conversations largely are being had. You know, we're working on problems that Greeks couldn't solve, and they had some really smart Greeks back then. So, yes, we have a weird president, and yes, he's divisive, and we all continue to, for whatever reason, we just do not like the president. Most of us will not like whoever the president is. Most of us didn't like George Bush. Most of us didn't like President Obama. Most of us don't like Donald Trump. That's not special. It's just, it's just sort of how we are right now. And if we worried a little bit less about deciding what Pete is, or what Peter is, or what Scott or John are, if you stop doing that and you just spend a few minutes knowing Scott, he's a good guy. And he and I might disagree on 2/3 of what politically gets there, but we all want the same damn thing.
I want to offer one caveat to that, because I do agree with you that these problems go back to not to the Greeks, but probably to the first two cavemen who sat there and had an argument about, whether big rocks or small rocks were the best to throw at mastodons or whatever. But one of the differences is the role of the internet now, because never before in human history have ideas been able to move as quickly, as unedited, as broadly as they do in history now. And people have acclimated to that. Once upon a time, the media was much slower. Information moved much slower. It didn't move globally in many cases at all, unless you had one of those big old-fashioned radios that you could tune in the BBC overseas service. Your media was very limited. Now, you have the ability to push information all over the world very, very quickly. Governments are starting to learn how powerful this tool is, and again, a discussion for another time, but we may have seen some elements of that in the last election. But politicians and bad actors are going to see that. I mean, one of the most salient remarks I've seen is, imagine Joseph Goebbels with the internet. He was able to propagandize the German people using radio and black and white movies. Imagine the tools of propaganda and information dissemination that we have now in the hands of somebody as brilliant, evilly brilliant as he is. And I think we're at early days with this. We're seeing people like Donald Trump, who is not particularly articulate. He seems kind of crudely effective in his use of Twitter, but it doesn't have the subtlety. It doesn't have the ability to kind of reach into a deeper audience than the people who are already kind of on his side in most cases. But he's just a version 1.0. There's a 1.5 coming and a 2.0 coming, people who are going to be better at this. And if we're not preparing for that now, by making sure that lots of voices are out there to counter bad thoughts, if we're not preparing for that now, when it does strike, it's going to be too late. I almost will draw the analogy to the NSA. If we had the chance to stop the widespread surveillance of all American citizens back in 2001 with the Patriot Act, and then we had a couple of other chances along the way. But the idea of disassembling the surveillance system that overgrids the United States right now, it's too late. It's done. It's over. We don't have those rights anymore. And I worry that our First Amendment rights and our broader rights to free speech, not just what's codified in the First Amendment and law, but the societal rights. The idea that a democracy, any democracy, is built on the free exchange of ideas, that concept is now under attack. And if we wait to fight back till everybody agrees it's under attack, it's too late at that point, and the voices will be silenced, the platforms will have fallen back on themselves, and bad people will be in the position of perhaps, we'll be generous with Twitter and everybody, well-meaning but ignorant people will be replaced by evil people.
That's terrible.
It's not a good future. I've lived in countries where that's been the way things have worked. I've lived in countries with dictators. I worked for the State Department for 24 years. I did a lot of traveling. I visited Iran. I've been in places where this is how society works. I was lucky enough, sorry kids, back in 1989 to live in Taiwan as they made their transition from dictatorship with a fully controlled media environment of the time to a more open democratic society, and watched it unfold. It was extraordinary. And to see that film running in reverse now inside my own country here in the United States strikes me and leaves me fearful, leaves me worried about living in the America I always was afraid to live in.
I want to punctuate that point that you just made, because a lot of listeners may confuse your sentiment with spite for being having been kicked off of Twitter. That's a small price to pay and sort of not the point.
Yep.
The point is that you've actually seen in your service in the State Department, you've actually seen the growth and progress of a government like the one in Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
Come out of the dark ages, to put it, poetically.
Yes.
And we're doing the opposite.
Yes.
So I will say that if we look at what happened to a guy like Brett Weinstein, or what's been happening to Jordan Peterson, both of whom I'm a huge fan of, I will say that you are at least in good company. And also their ability to reach people exploded because of what happened to them.
Yeah.
What do you think the chances are that the world is going to see the good sense of Peter Van Buren because of prohibition?
First, we have to that requires an assumption that there's anything worth listening to here, and I'll leave that for others to judge. But I went through a similar process, 8 years ago when the government tried to silence me when I wrote my book. And a lot of the things that are happening now have nasty little touch points there. And one of them is the what they call attacks ad hominem, the idea of attacking me as a person rather than attacking my ideas. When Pete was joking earlier about me being a dick, things like that, where we try to get rid of me as easily as possible. The same thing happens, for example, when you take Alex Jones and dismiss him, quote, as a conspiracy theorist, unquote. He certainly has promoted his share of conspiracy theories, but that makes up a very small part of his overall thinking. The hope here is that the struggle will play out in the right way, that the more that places like Twitter and other platforms try to silence voices, the more that causes people to maybe notice those people and discover them for the first time, the examples you gave there. I hope that's the way the struggle plays out. I hope that the answer to this is Twitter realizing that it is wrong to censor people, that it may call more attention to them than Twitter would like, and maybe opening Twitter back up to that cacophony of voices is the right answer. I fear, though, that there are people who will never be discovered. Good voices, people with important ideas that we should be listening to, that no one is going to go looking for them. The idea would be if, again, we picked on Alex Jones, but I mean, if Alex Jones disappears from Twitter, he's got a big enough base out there that they'll go looking for him and find him where he is. Whereas an awful lot of good thought may be sitting right on MySpace right now, waiting for Bing to index them and put them on Napster. Any people may get the references there to all these defunct platforms that you can't get an audience of 3 on. That's where the danger comes right now, because Twitter, for better or worse, is at the top of the pile. That's where people go to listen to others. That's where they go to speak. That's where they go to find ideas. And if we lose that battle, we don't go backwards. We only can find more places that are going to follow the Twitter model. So I hope that Twitter is paying attention to the fact that people are moving away from them to find these voices in other places. And I hope that will help mitigate Twitter's strategy of silencing people ahead of these midterm elections, when in fact they should be opening the door even wider to new ideas.
If you guys want to understand more of what Peter writes about, you can go to his website where he blogs. It's called wemeantwell.com. You can also purchase his books there, Hooper's War, Ghost of Tom Joad, and We Meant Well, the book that he writes about his time in Iraq as a State Department employee. I mean, you're not talking crazy talk here, Peter. You're talking exactly what we need to do. And one of the things I like about the blockchain is that some of this stuff is washed away. It's not a single entity. It's not monolithic, and something like Twitter, if it does keep this up, if it does have the disparity between Sarah Jeong's hate speech being out there and your, dissent being blocked, then they're going to suffer for it, because it's not going to be a place of ideas. It's going to be an echo chamber, and echo chambers are hard to sell. The Russians need to talk to somebody, so when they buy their ads, they need to buy ads where the people that they're trying to move are, and it just. Look, at Jack, I'm talking to you right now, and I'll go on the record. This is nonsense. You should stop. And if you want to be credible, you have to do things. Look, Uber, everybody wanted Uber until Uber started screwing everything up and got arrogant. This is arrogance from Twitter's part. It's folly, and folly doesn't work out well for things. So I'm glad to sit down with you, Jack, and have these conversations and hear your side of it. But again, no response. We reach out and you try to. This is the guy that's on a social media platform. He's got @Jack. That's his tag on Twitter, and you can't get the guy to talk on social media. Well, again, that's arrogance, and those things are paid back with people walking away. So.
Well, let me send my own message to @Jack. Who knows what podcasts he listens to in his spare time? Jack, you know where to find me. I know you're a busy man. Have one of your assistants give me a call. Let that person explain to me why I was banned from Twitter. Let me explain to them why I think dissenting voices are important. Let us have that conversation, and at the end of that conversation, if you articulate to me the reasons that I was banned and it seems to make sense, I will put that on my blog without comment and say, I think these guys are right and I was wrong. I'll offer that to you. I'm nobody, but @Jack, if you're listening, give me a call.